Now, it's rare for judges to talk publicly outside the courtroom, but one High Court judge says he can simply hold his tongue no longer. Sir Paul Coleridge has worked for 40 years in family law, and he says he's had enough of watching the endless breakdown of marriage and seeing the destruction it wreaks on the children whose parents break up. His message is quite simple: mend it, don't end it. And to get that across, he's set up a charity called the Marriage Foundation. So almost 120,000 couples divorced in England and Wales in 2010. That's an increase of 4.9% on the previous year. And around half of those couples had at least one child living with them during the breakdown. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Harry Benson from the Marriage Foundation and also by Charlotte Friedman, a former family law barrister who's now a trained therapist and founder of the Divorce Support Group. So, Harry Benson, first, paint a picture, if you can, of the kind of people who are getting divorced now who you think shouldn't be.
Well, it's not just divorce. It's family breakdown generally. We've got a problem in this country that costs the government and the taxpayer, therefore, something in the order of £44 billion a year. It's an enormous problem, costs more than the defence budget, and yet there's barely any effort, any policy made to try and reduce or prevent this problem. It comes in two parts. Up until about 1980, divorce rates rose through the 60s and 70s, and they stayed pretty much at the same level in spite of what you just said. Divorce rates remain fairly high, but they're not huge. The breakup of unmarried parents has been the real driver of family breakdown, so that we've now got a situation when, from 1980, when there were 1 million lone parents, there's now 2 million lone parents. Family breakdown's doubled. It's the trend away from marriage, and that's what Sir Paul Coleridge and colleagues are talking about. They've been at the sharp end for many years, and it's about time that someone said something about this.
Charlotte Friedman, quite apart from the emotional cost, that £44 billion a year figure, we can't afford that, can we?
Well, I'm interested in the emotional cost of divorce, and I absolutely agree that it's absolutely devastating to divorce, and it's a bereavement, and people have to cope with a whole wealth of overwhelming feelings. But nobody that I've ever met who comes to Divorce Support Group for support has ever left their marriage or their relationships, their long-term relationships, easily. People leave their marriages after many, many years of being unhappy and having couple counselling, having therapy, trying to work it out with elders in the community or religious leaders or family friends. And only when they find they absolutely can't do they take that enormous decision to separate.
Aren't you trying to turn the clock back to the 1950s? I mean, if a woman is trapped in a loveless marriage, her husband's been unfaithful several times, for example, surely then divorce or breakup is really the only option.
It's a terrible cliche that people say that you've either got to be stuck in a loveless marriage, or you can divorce and thereby theoretically become suddenly happy. There are two types of breakup, whether married or unmarried, and the level of conflict is the thing that matters. In high conflict relationships, nobody argues that these things shouldn't either stop. There should be less conflict, or they should come to an end, and kids generally do better out of those. It's the low conflict breakups that are most devastating to children, because they just don't see it coming, and that has huge knock-on effects, drifting apart and growing apart and just not loving each other anymore. These ought to be the relationships that are most salvageable as well.
So what about salvaging relationships like that? Isn't the problem here that we're used to instant gratification? People aren't prepared to work at things anymore.
Well, I think as a society, I think we have changed enormously over the last 20 or 30 years. And I think people feel now that they should have their needs met, they should have their feelings listened to, and they should be entitled to act on them. And that's why people feel that they now have an option, they have the freedom to choose divorce or choose separation if that's what they want to do. 30 years ago, people didn't have that option. There was also a terrible stigma and taboo attached to divorce, which there isn't now. So 30 years ago, 40 years ago, people spent 30 years in a marriage, but that didn't mean that they were happy or fulfilled. And I think now, although divorce is absolutely devastating and there are terrible consequences and repercussions of it, people have the freedom to try again and to see if they can find happiness elsewhere.
Freedom, happiness, laudable aims, surely.
Well, yes, but the key thing for kids is that they don't want to see their parents fighting, and they do want to see their parents staying together in a happy in a contented relationship. And there are all sorts of things that one can do about it. And one thing is that you can learn. I happen to run courses that teach couples how to stay together. That's one thing, and these are widespread around the country. The other issue is simply getting married in the first place.
Would tax breaks help promote marriage, in your view?
I think that's a very good question, and it's been a very contentious issue. Tax breaks would send a very big signal from government. More than anything else, it would send a signal that the government is serious about redressing the situation and saying, yes, you know, we should be starting our relationships by getting married. I don't think giving 20 quid a week is going to make any difference, particularly to an individual couple, but it will send this fantastic signal that we're stuck with this massive problem, and marriage is part of the answer, or if not the answer, to sorting this thing out, whilst not being a panacea, of course.
Does marriage make a difference rather than cohabiting?
Well, I think people who cohabit for a long time, they're equally as committed as people who are married. And people who want to spend their lives together do, whether they're married or they're not. And if you separate after a long-term relationship, it doesn't matter whether you're married, and it doesn't matter if you've been cohabiting. The separation is still devastating. And for my part, the important thing is supporting people who make that momentous decision to separate.
Charlotte Friedman, Harry Benson, thank you very much for coming in. John.
After the break.